The smallest detail can decide whether a king lives long enough to see the next sunrise. No one in Blackstone Keep believed that. They believed strength protected kings. They believed steel, loyal guards, and towering castle walls were enough. Emily Carter knew better. She had spent the last 4 years as a maid in the royal stables, polishing carriage lamps before dawn, sweeping straw from stone floors, and cleaning mud from the wheels of the Alpha King's coaches. To everyone else, she was invisible. Servants hurried past without greeting her. Noblemen never learned her name. Even the stable master rarely looked at her unless another chore needed to be done. Emily had long accepted that invisibility was part of her life. Yet being unnoticed had taught her something most people never learned. When nobody looked at you, you had plenty of time to look at everyone else. Every morning began before the castle bells rang. While the palace still slept beneath a blanket of gray mist, Emily crossed the quiet courtyard carrying a wooden bucket filled with brushes, fresh cloths, and lamp oil. The royal stables were always awake before sunrise. Horses shifted inside their stalls, stable boys whispered to one another, and distant blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into horseshoes. Emily liked those peaceful hours. They were honest. Horses never lied. Wheels never pretended. Leather straps either showed wear or they did not. Every object told a story if someone cared enough to notice it. That morning felt different the moment she stepped beneath the stable archway. The air carried an unusual silence. Stable boys who normally laughed while feeding the horses spoke in hushed voices. A pair of royal guards stood near the largest carriage instead of their usual post by the castle gate. Even the horses seemed restless, stamping their hooves against the stone floor as though sensing something invisible drifting through the cold air. Emily set down her bucket and began wiping dried mud from one of the massive carriage wheels. It was the Alpha King state carriage, built from polished black oak with silver wolf emblems carved into every door. By midday, Alpha King Logan Hayes would leave Blackstone Keep to attend the annual gathering of neighboring Alpha rulers. Whenever the king traveled, every servant understood their responsibilities. Nothing could be overlooked. Emily carefully polished each metal fitting until it reflected the pale morning light. She checked every wheel spoke, every leather harness, every lantern hook with the same quiet precision she used every day. Some servants teased her for working too slowly. Emily never argued. She simply believed that small mistakes often hid inside ordinary moments. Across the courtyard, preparations continued with growing urgency. Soldiers tightened saddle straps. Messengers carried sealed letters toward the main gate. Palace servants loaded travel chests into wagons, while cooks packed supplies for the journey ahead. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Yet Emily could not explain why an uneasy feeling settled in her chest as she watched the royal carriage waiting silently beneath the mist-covered sky. Emily forced herself to look away from the uneasy feeling and continued polishing the silver trim beneath the carriage door. Experience had taught her that fear without evidence solved nothing. If something was wrong, the truth would reveal itself through details, just as it always did. A distant horn echoed across the castle grounds, announcing that less than an hour remained before Alpha King Logan Hayes would depart. Activity immediately doubled. Stable boys hurried between stalls carrying saddles. Royal attendants inspected luggage one final time. Captains barked orders as armored guards formed neat lines leading from the palace entrance to the waiting carriage. Blackstone Keep transformed from peaceful silence into disciplined motion. Then the Alpha King appeared. Logan Hayes descended the grand staircase with the effortless confidence of a ruler who had spent his entire life carrying responsibility. His black cloak moved gently behind him in the morning breeze, the silver wolf crest embroidered across his shoulders catching the first rays of sunlight. Noble advisors followed several steps behind, while his beta commander walked close enough to discuss the journey in quiet voices. Every servant immediately lowered their heads. Emily did the same, though only for a moment. She had learned long ago that respect did not require blindness. As Logan crossed the courtyard, her attention drifted toward the carriage waiting beside the stone fountain. Everything looked perfectly prepared. The horses stood harnessed and calm. Their polished leather bridles gleamed without a single scratch. The luggage had been secured exactly as protocol required. Even the lanterns hanging beside the carriage doors had been freshly filled with oil earlier that morning. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet that strange uneasiness refused to leave. Emily slowly walked around the rear wheel, pretending to inspect dried mud trapped beneath the axle. From there she could clearly see the driver seated high upon the carriage bench. His broad shoulders were hidden beneath the familiar dark uniform worn by every royal coachman. A heavy travel cloak covered most of his body, while the brim of his leather hat cast a shadow across his face. At first glance, there was absolutely nothing unusual about him. Emily almost smiled at herself for imagining danger where none existed. Then the driver shifted slightly to adjust the reins. Her eyes followed the movement without thinking. He gathered every leather strap firmly into his left hand before tightening them with practiced confidence. Emily froze. Her cloth slipped quietly from her fingers onto the stone ground below. She did not immediately understand why the simple movement unsettled her so deeply. Then memory answered before reason could. Benjamin Foster, the Alpha King's longtime royal driver, had trained stable workers countless times while preparing for long journeys. Emily had watched him for years. Every single morning, every single departure, Benjamin always held the reins in his right hand while checking the horses with his left. He often joked that changing hands felt like trying to write with someone else's fingers. It had become such a natural habit that nobody could have persuaded him otherwise. Emily slowly lifted her eyes toward the figure on the driver's bench once more. This man had not hesitated for even a heartbeat. He handled the carriage exactly the opposite way. A cold shiver traveled down her spine as one quiet thought entered her mind. What if the man waiting to drive the Alpha King away from Blackstone Keep was not Benjamin Foster at all? Emily remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the driver's gloved hands. For a brief moment, she hoped she had remembered incorrectly. People made mistakes. Memories faded. Perhaps Benjamin Foster had finally decided to change an old habit after all these years. But the longer she watched, the more impossible that explanation became. The driver clicked his tongue to calm the horses. Again, he used his left hand to steady the reins while his right adjusted the leather whip resting beside him. Every movement looked practiced, yet strangely unfamiliar. It was not the awkwardness of an inexperienced coachman. It was the confidence of someone performing another man's role. Emily slowly bent to retrieve the cloth she had dropped, using the motion as an excuse to keep watching without drawing attention. As she stood again, another detail caught her eye. The driver's riding boots were spotless. Not simply clean, untouched. Benjamin spent every morning walking through damp straw, muddy paddocks, and freshly watered stable yards before preparing the royal carriage. His boots were never polished to perfection, no matter how hard he tried. These boots looked as though they had just been removed from a tailor's display. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She glanced toward the stable entrance where Benjamin normally appeared before every departure, carrying a small leather pouch filled with horse treats. He believed rewarding the horses before a journey kept them calm on long roads. Today, there was no sign of him. Instead, two unfamiliar stable hands hurried past, avoiding eye contact with everyone around them. One disappeared into the storage barn. The other quickly closed the heavy wooden doors behind him. Emily frowned. The stable doors were never closed during departure preparations. There was simply too much movement. Horses, servants, wagons, and guards all needed constant access. The closed doors looked wrong. Everything looked wrong. Yet nobody else seemed to notice. Noble advisors discussed maps spread across a wooden table. Palace servants continued stacking travel chests inside supply wagons. The beta commander inspected the line of royal guards while speaking confidently about the safest route through the mountain pass. Around them, life continued with perfect order. Emily felt strangely alone, as though she were standing inside a crowded courtyard where only she could hear a distant warning bell. She forced herself to breathe slowly. Fear was useless without proof. She needed something undeniable. Her eyes returned to the carriage. The horses shifted impatiently, causing the driver to pull gently on the reins. As his sleeves slid back for only an instant, Emily caught sight of his wrist. A narrow scar crossed the inside of his left forearm. She had never seen Benjamin with such a mark. More importantly, Benjamin never removed the braided leather bracelet his daughter had woven years earlier. Every stable worker knew about it because he proudly showed it to anyone willing to listen. The bracelet was gone. Emily's stomach tightened. This was no longer one strange habit. It was a pattern. Different hands. Different boots. Missing bracelet. Missing driver. Closed stable doors. Too many coincidences had gathered around a single carriage carrying the most powerful man in the kingdom. Across the courtyard, Alpha King Logan Hayes finished speaking with his advisors and began walking toward the waiting carriage. Every step brought him closer to the polished black door. Emily looked from the approaching king to the silent driver above the horses. She no longer wondered whether something was wrong. The only question left was whether she could stop it before the Alpha King placed one foot inside the carriage. Emily knew she had only seconds left. Once Alpha King Logan Hayes stepped into the carriage, whatever trap had been prepared would be beyond her reach. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. They trembled because she understood exactly what would happen if she was wrong. A maid who publicly interrupted the king's departure could be dismissed, imprisoned, or worse. Yet another thought rose louder than every consequence. What if she stayed silent? Logan continued walking toward the carriage, surrounded by guards whose polished armor reflected the morning sun. Noble officials followed close behind, discussing treaties and border disputes as though the kingdom's future depended entirely on politics. None of them spared a glance toward the driver waiting patiently on the bench. Emily took one step forward, then another. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She could still turn back. She could pretend she had noticed nothing. No one would ever blame an invisible servant for remaining invisible. But Benjamin Foster's missing bracelet, the spotless boots, the closed stable doors, and the unfamiliar hands on the reins refused to leave her mind. They fit together too perfectly to ignore. Logan reached the final stone step before the carriage. One royal guard opened the polished door, while another bowed respectfully. The horses stood unnaturally still, as if they too were waiting for something to happen. Emily suddenly began walking faster. By the time anyone noticed, she was already crossing the open courtyard. "Your Majesty." Her voice was not loud, but it was enough. Conversation stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward the young maid moving directly toward the royal carriage. The nearest guards instantly blocked her path, lowering their spears. "Stay back," one ordered sharply. Emily looked past them at Logan. "Please, don't step into that carriage." An uncomfortable silence settled across the courtyard. Several nobles exchanged irritated glances. The Beta commander frowned before taking 2 deliberate steps toward Emily. He was Nathan Brooks, the Alpha King's most trusted military advisor, a man whose reputation for discipline was known throughout the kingdom. His cold eyes settled on the frightened maid. "Explain yourself," he said. Emily swallowed. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed upon her. "Your driver," she began, forcing the words through her dry throat, "has been replaced." A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd. Then came laughter. One noble actually shook his head in amusement. Another whispered something that caused several attendants to smile. Nathan Brooks' expression hardened immediately. "Do you understand what accusation you have just made?" Emily nodded without looking away from Logan. "The man holding those reins is not Benjamin Foster." Nathan's voice became dangerously quiet. "Know your place, maid." 2 guards seized Emily by both arms before she could move another step. The rough grip tightened around her sleeves as they pulled her backward across the stone courtyard. "Servants do not interrupt royal departures," Nathan continued. "And they certainly do not accuse loyal officers without proof." Emily struggled against their hold, her eyes fixed desperately on Logan, who had not spoken a single word. His hand still rested on the open carriage door. Only one step remained before he climbed inside. "Please," Emily cried, louder this time. "Don't step in. Your driver isn't the real one." The courtyard fell silent once more. Logan's hand remained frozen on the carriage door, and for the first time that morning, the Alpha King's sharp gaze shifted from his waiting carriage to the terrified maid who was willing to risk everything to stop him. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. Emily struggled against the guards holding her arms, while Alpha King Logan Hayes stood motionless beside the open carriage door. His sharp gray eyes never left her face. There was no anger in his expression, only calculation. He had ruled long enough to know that fear could be faked, but genuine conviction was far more difficult to imitate. Emily looked terrified, yet she had not withdrawn a single word. Nathan Brooks broke the silence first. "Your Majesty," he said calmly. This servant has delayed your departure with a ridiculous accusation. Allow me to have her removed." Logan did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the driver sitting patiently atop the carriage. The man remained perfectly still beneath the brim of his hat, showing neither surprise nor concern. That, more than anything, unsettled Logan. Benjamin Foster had driven him for nearly 15 years. Benjamin always smiled before a journey and usually greeted him with some harmless complaint about the weather or the condition of the roads. Today's driver had said nothing at all. Logan slowly withdrew his hand from the carriage door. The movement was small, but Emily noticed it immediately. Hope flickered across her face. Nathan noticed as well. "Your Majesty?" he asked cautiously. Logan spoke without taking his eyes off the carriage. "Driver." The man on the bench looked down. "Yes, Your Majesty?" His voice was rough, lower than Benjamin's familiar tone. Logan frowned almost imperceptibly. "Remove your hat." A heartbeat passed, then another. The driver hesitated. It lasted barely a second, yet in the royal courtyard, where obedience was expected instantly, that single hesitation felt enormous. Emily's pulse quickened. The guards gripping her arms glanced uncertainly toward one another. Nathan Brooks stepped forward quickly. "Surely this is unnecessary. We are already behind schedule." Logan ignored him. His voice became colder. "I gave you an order." The driver slowly reached for the brim of his hat, but instead of lifting it, his right hand disappeared inside his heavy cloak. Emily's eyes widened. "Move!" she screamed with every ounce of strength she possessed. At that exact instant, she wrenched one arm free from the startled guard and threw herself toward the Alpha King. Her shoulder slammed into Logan's chest with enough force to knock him sideways, away from the open carriage door. The world exploded into motion. A violent metallic snap echoed from inside the carriage. Hidden beneath the velvet seat, a powerful spring mechanism released with terrifying force. A steel bolt shot through the open doorway exactly where Logan's heart had been a fraction of a second earlier. Instead, the bolt smashed into a stone pillar behind him with a deafening crack, burying itself deep into solid granite. The courtyard froze. No one breathed. Dust drifted from the shattered pillar while the deadly projectile vibrated violently inside the stone. Emily lay on the ground beside the Alpha King, stunned by what had just happened. Logan stared at the bolt embedded in the pillar, then slowly turned toward the carriage. The disguised driver no longer reached for his hat. He was holding a curved dagger. Before anyone could react, he leaped from the driver's bench, shoved one of the horses aside, and sprinted toward the outer gate. "Assassin!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards drew their swords. Horses reared in panic. Nobles scattered across the courtyard. Logan rose to his feet, his expression transformed from cautious curiosity into absolute certainty. Emily had not imagined the danger. She had saved his life only seconds before death reached him. Steel rang against steel as the castle courtyard erupted into complete chaos. "Seal the gates," Logan roared, his voice cutting through the confusion like a blade. "Take him alive." Royal guards reacted instantly. Half the soldiers sprinted toward the fleeing assassin while others surrounded the Alpha King, raising their shields in case another attack was waiting. The disguised driver darted between frightened horses and overturned supply crates with astonishing speed. He clearly knew the layout of Blackstone Keep. He was not running blindly. He was following a planned escape route. Nathan Brooks drew his sword and joined the pursuit, vaulting over a wooden barrel without slowing down. "Cut him off at the East Arch," he shouted. Two squads broke away immediately, racing toward the outer wall. Emily slowly pushed herself off the cold stone pavement, her shoulder aching from the impact that had knocked Logan out of danger. She barely noticed the pain. Her eyes remained fixed on the assassin disappearing through the stable yard. Then another realization struck her. If the fake driver had replaced Benjamin Foster, where was the real coachman? Logan seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Search the stables," he ordered. "Now." For guards rushed through the large wooden doors that Emily had noticed earlier that morning. The heavy doors burst inward with a loud crash. Moments later, frightened voices echoed from inside. "Over here," someone yelled. "We found him." Logan strode into the stable without hesitation, Emily following several cautious steps behind despite the confused servants staring at her. Deep inside a storage room, Hidden behind stacked hay bales, Benjamin Foster lay bound hand and foot with thick ropes. A cloth had been tied tightly across his mouth. His face was bruised, and dried blood stained one side of his forehead, but his eyes widened with relief the moment he saw the Alpha King. Guards quickly cut the ropes while the palace physician knelt beside him. Benjamin struggled to sit upright. "Your Majesty," he rasped after the gag was removed. "Forgive me. They came before dawn." Logan crouched beside the injured coachman. "How many?" Benjamin swallowed painfully. "3 men. They wore stable uniforms. I thought they were new workers until one struck me from behind." Emily listened quietly from the doorway. Every word confirmed what she had feared. Benjamin looked around the stable until his eyes landed on her. Recognition filled his exhausted face. "Miss Carter," he whispered. You stopped him?" No one answered immediately. They didn't have to. Benjamin slowly looked toward the shattered bruise forming on Logan's shoulder where Emily had pushed him aside. Then he noticed the frightened expression on every servant's face. Understanding settled over him. "She saved your life," Benjamin said softly. Silence filled the stable once again. Logan stood without speaking. His sharp eyes turned toward Emily. For the first time since the morning had begun, he looked at her not as another servant among hundreds, but as the one person who had noticed what every experienced guard, advisor, and officer had completely missed. Before he could speak, the pounding of hurried footsteps echoed through the stable entrance. A captain of the guard rushed inside, breathing heavily. "Your Majesty," he reported, "the assassin escaped beyond the eastern wall, but we recovered this." He held out a small leather pouch found near the escape route. Logan accepted it and loosened the drawstring. Inside lay several silver coins bearing the crest of Blackstone Keep, freshly minted royal currency. The stable fell deathly quiet. Whoever had hired the assassin had not come from outside the kingdom. Someone inside the castle had paid for the Alpha King's murder. The discovery inside the stable should have ended every doubt. It did not. If anything, it made the situation even more dangerous. Someone inside Blackstone Keep had planned the assassination with enough precision to replace the Alpha King's trusted coachman, hide a deadly mechanism inside the royal carriage, and nearly escape without leaving a trace. That meant one terrifying truth remained. The real mastermind was still inside the castle. Logan stared at the pouch of royal coins in silence before closing it tightly in his hand. "No one leaves Blackstone Keep," he ordered. "Seal every gate. Search every chamber. I want the names of everyone who entered the stable before dawn." His guards scattered immediately, carrying his commands throughout the fortress. Yet even as soldiers rushed into action, whispers had already begun spreading through the servants' quarters. Emily noticed them the moment she stepped back into the courtyard. Conversations stopped whenever she passed. Curious eyes followed her from every direction. Some looked grateful. Others looked suspicious. A frightened kitchen maid hurried past and quietly whispered, "They're saying you knew about the trap before anyone else." Emily's heart sank. She had expected questions. She had not expected suspicion. Before she could respond, Nathan Brooks approached with 2 armed guards at his side. His expression revealed nothing. "Emily Carter," he said evenly. "His Majesty requests that you remain available until this investigation is complete." The words sounded polite, but the guards surrounding him told a different story. Emily nodded. "Of course." Nathan studied her face for a long moment. "There is one question I cannot ignore." She met his eyes. "How did you know?" Emily answered honestly. "I recognized that the driver wasn't Benjamin Foster." Nathan folded his arms. "Only after noticing the reins." "No. Then what?" "The reins. The boots. The missing bracelet. The scar on his wrist. The stable doors being closed. None of it matched." Nathan remained silent, but one of the officers beside him frowned. "Convenient," the man muttered. "Very convenient." Emily turned toward him. "What do you mean?" The officer stepped forward. "You noticed details that trained guards somehow missed. You interrupted the king's departure at the exact moment. And somehow you knew there was danger before anyone else." He paused deliberately, perhaps because you already knew the plan. The accusation struck the courtyard harder than any shouted command. Several servants gasped. Emily felt the color drain from her face. "That's not true, isn't it?" The officer continued. "If the assassin escaped, perhaps his partner stayed behind." Nathan finally raised one hand. silencing the growing whispers. Enough. But the damage had already been done. Suspicion spread through the crowd with frightening speed. Logan emerged from the stable just as the murmurs reached him. His eyes swept across the tents gathering before resting briefly on Emily. He had witnessed her save his life with his own eyes. Yet he also understood something every ruler eventually learned. Conspiracies often hid behind acts of apparent heroism. "No one is to question Miss Carter without my permission," Logan said firmly. "She remains under royal protection until this investigation is concluded." The words shielded Emily from immediate arrest, but they did not erase the doubt growing inside the castle walls. Somewhere within Blackstone Keep, the true architect of the failed assassination had just learned two dangerous facts. The Alpha King was still alive, and the unnoticed maid who had ruined everything would now have to be silenced before she noticed anything else. Night settled over Blackstone Keep, but not a single torch along the fortress walls was extinguished. Soldiers searched every corridor. Servants were questioned one by one. Every stable worker, cook, guard, and messenger was ordered to remain inside the castle until the investigation ended. Yet despite hours of searching, the mastermind remained invisible. Emily sat alone inside a small chamber beside the royal library, the room assigned to her by Logan's order for her own protection. Two guards stood outside the door. Officially, they were there to protect the woman who had saved the Alpha King. Unofficially, they also ensured she could not disappear. Emily understood both reasons. She stared through the narrow window toward the stable yard where everything had begun that morning. Again and again, she replayed every detail in her mind. The fake driver, the closed stable doors, the hidden crossbow, the pouch of royal coins. Something still refused to fit. Assassins were hired to kill. But whoever planned this attack had gone to extraordinary lengths to replace Benjamin Foster instead of simply attacking the carriage along the road. That required someone who understood the castle's daily routines perfectly, someone trusted enough to move freely before dawn. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Logan entered the room without ceremony, dismissing the guards with a quiet gesture. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The Alpha King walked toward the window and looked over the dark courtyard below. "Everyone keeps asking how you knew," he finally said. Emily lowered her eyes. "I only noticed things that didn't belong." Logan turned toward her. "No." His voice remained calm. "You noticed because you were paying attention while everyone else assumed routine meant safety." Emily looked surprised. Logan continued, "My captains watch enemies. My advisors watch politics. My nobles watch one another." His expression softened slightly. "You watch people." Emily hesitated before answering. "When you're invisible, Your Majesty, observing becomes a habit." The simple sentence lingered in the room. Logan understood immediately. Servants survived by noticing moods, footsteps, voices, and tiny changes before trouble reached them. What nobles dismissed as ordinary housekeeping had quietly trained Emily into an exceptional observer. She had not predicted danger because of magic, destiny, or secret power. She had seen patterns others ignored because no one had ever bothered to notice her. A hurried knock echoed outside the chamber. Nathan Brooks entered carrying a folded piece of parchment recovered from the abandoned stable office. "Your Majesty," he said, placing it on the table. "One of our investigators found this hidden beneath the floorboards." Logan unfolded the weathered page. It contained a delivery schedule for royal supplies, written in ordinary ink. At first glance, it seemed completely harmless. Emily stepped closer without thinking. Her eyes drifted across the columns before stopping near the bottom of the page. "Wait." Logan looked at her. Emily pointed toward a tiny mark beside one shipment date. "Benjamin never wrote numbers like this." Nathan frowned. "How could you possibly know that?" Emily answered quietly. "Every month I helped him organize feed deliveries. He always crossed his sevens with a short line." She touched the parchment. These numbers were written by someone else, someone pretending to be him. Nathan leaned closer. The handwriting looked almost identical, but now that Emily had pointed it out, the difference became unmistakable. Logan's eyes narrowed. The forged schedule had authorized unusual access to the stable before dawn on the very morning of the assassination. It was not merely evidence. It was proof that the conspiracy had been planned from inside the castle for weeks. For the second time in a single day, The unnoticed Maid had uncovered the truth hidden in the smallest detail, while everyone else had been looking at the larger picture. 3 days later, the entire court of Blackstone Keep gathered inside the Great Hall. The towering stone chamber, usually reserved for treaties and celebrations, carried an entirely different atmosphere that morning. Every noble stood in silence. Every captain of the guard wore full ceremonial armor. Servants lined the walls with lowered eyes, whispering quietly among themselves. News of the failed assassination had spread throughout the kingdom, but very few knew how close their Alpha King had come to dying. Logan Hayes sat upon the ancient throne beneath the banners of his bloodline, his expression calm but unreadable. Beside him stood Nathan Brooks, holding the forged delivery schedule and the pouch of royal coins recovered after the attack. In the center of the hall, 6 men knelt with their hands bound behind their backs. The investigation had finally uncovered the conspiracy. 2 stable workers had accepted bribes to help replace Benjamin Foster before dawn. A royal quartermaster had forged official records to disguise the movements of the assassins. The final conspirator, a senior noble who had secretly financed the plot in exchange for promises of power, now knelt with his head lowered before the throne he had nearly stolen through murder. Logan rose slowly. His voice carried effortlessly across the silent hall. Greed convinced these men that my kingdom could be bought with silver. Nathan stepped forward and placed the leather pouch before the assembled court. These coins were minted inside Blackstone Keep, he announced. The investigation confirmed they were withdrawn under false authority using forged documents. He then lifted the delivery schedule. This forgery led our investigators directly to every member of the conspiracy. The accused noble desperately raised his head. Your Majesty, I was deceived. Logan's cold gaze never changed. You were exposed. Guards immediately dragged the conspirators away as their desperate pleas echoed through the hall before disappearing behind heavy wooden doors. Silence returned. Then Logan looked toward the entrance. Bring her forward. The massive doors opened once more. Emily Carter entered quietly, still wearing the simple gray uniform of a castle maid. She had not been dressed in silk. She wore no jewelry. The faint bruise on her shoulder from saving the Alpha King remained visible beneath the plain fabric of her sleeve. As she walked across the polished stone floor, many nobles lowered their eyes in embarrassment. They remembered laughing when she had cried, "Don't step in." Your driver was replaced. They remembered calling her a foolish servant who had forgotten her place. Now not one of them could meet her gaze. Emily stopped several steps before the throne and bowed respectfully. Logan descended the stone steps himself, something no one in the great hall had expected. He stopped directly before the maid whose courage had changed the fate of the kingdom. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then he turned toward the entire court. 3 days ago, he said, my captain saw nothing. His eyes moved across the assembled officers. My advisors suspected nothing. His gaze shifted toward the nobles. My court believed everything was normal. He finally rested his eyes upon Emily. One maid noticed what an entire kingdom overlooked. No one spoke. Logan continued, his voice firm enough to reach every corner of the chamber. She was mocked for speaking. He paused. She was accused for telling the truth. Another silence followed before he declared, and because she refused to remain silent, your Alpha King is alive today. The words struck the hall with greater force than any royal decree. Logan removed the silver wolf-shaped protection clasp fastened to his royal cloak, an honor carried only by those under the direct protection of the Alpha King himself. He fastened it carefully onto Emily's simple uniform. From this day forward, he proclaimed, Emily Carter stands under my personal protection. Anyone who threatens her, threatens the throne itself. A stunned silence filled the hall before every captain present struck a closed fist against his breastplate in salute. One by one, the nobles followed with respectful bows. Even the servants lining the walls straightened with pride as they watched one of their own receive an honor no maid had ever imagined. Emily looked down at the silver clasp resting against her humble uniform, hardly believing it was real. She had never wanted titles, wealth, or recognition. She had only wanted to stop a man from stepping into a carriage that morning. Logan looked at her once more before addressing the court for the final time. Remember this day, he said quietly. A kingdom was not saved by the strongest warrior, the richest noble, or the wisest advisor. It was saved by the one person everyone believed was too insignificant to matter. And from that moment forward, no one inside Blackstone Keep ever looked at the invisible Maid the same way again. Weeks passed, and life inside Blackstone Keep gradually settled into a new rhythm, though nothing was truly the same. The shattered stone pillar struck by the assassin's bolt remained standing in the royal courtyard. Logan had ordered that it never be repaired. Every soldier who entered the castle walked past the scar left by the steel bolt buried deep within the granite. It served as a reminder that even the strongest fortress could fall when its people stopped paying attention. Emily returned to her ordinary duties, refusing every suggestion that she abandon the work she had always known. Each morning, she carried breakfast trays through the eastern corridor, polished silver in the royal dining hall, and organized supplies for the castle kitchens just as she had before. The only visible difference was the silver wolf clasp fastened neatly above her heart. No one laughed when she entered a room anymore. Guards stepped aside to let her pass. Noble ladies who had once ignored her now greeted her with respectful nods. Younger servants quietly watched her with admiration, realizing that courage did not always wear armor. One crisp autumn morning, Emily crossed the stable yard carrying a ledger of supply deliveries. Benjamin Foster stood beside the royal carriage, carefully inspecting the harnesses before another journey. The old coachman smiled as soon as he saw her. "Still checking everyone's handwriting?" he asked with a gentle laugh. Emily smiled back. "Only when something feels wrong." Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. "Good." He rested one weathered hand against the polished carriage door. "Keep doing it. Kingdoms survive because someone notices the small things." Before Emily could answer, another stable boy rushed toward them carrying a stack of new delivery records. The young servant looked nervous. "Miss Carter," he said, "the quartermaster asked if you would review these before they're filed." Emily accepted the papers without surprise. What had once been considered meaningless attention to detail had quietly become one of the castle's greatest safeguards. Logan himself had ordered that no important records involving the royal household would be finalized until Emily had examined them. Not because she possessed magical gifts or extraordinary rank, but because she had earned something rarer than either. She had earned trust. Later that afternoon, Logan watched the courtyard from the balcony outside his study. Nathan Brooks joined him, following the Alpha King's gaze toward the stable yard below, where Emily patiently explained proper inventory records to several young servants. Nathan folded his arms. "The castle feels different." Logan nodded. "It is." Nathan looked toward the damaged stone pillar that still stood untouched near the entrance. "Do you ever regret leaving it there?" Logan answered without hesitation. "No." His eyes remained on Emily. Walls protect a kingdom from enemies outside. He paused thoughtfully. People like her protect it from enemies within. Nathan remained silent, knowing the Alpha King was right. Strength alone had not saved Blackstone Keep. Neither had swords, rank, or authority. It had been the quiet courage of a maid who refused to ignore a detail everyone else dismissed. As the afternoon sun settled across the ancient castle walls, Emily closed the final ledger, thanked the young servants for their help, and continued carrying out the ordinary work that had once made her invisible. Yet every person who watched her understood the same truth now. Greatness had never been hidden beneath a crown or a title. Sometimes it walked silently through a castle carrying a tray, holding a ledger, or opening a carriage door, seeing what no one else thought to notice. And because one unnoticed maid had chosen to speak instead of remain silent, an Alpha King lived, a kingdom endured, and Blackstone Keep would never again mistake humility for insignificance. Winter arrived at Blackstone Keep with a silence that covered the mountains in white. Snow rested upon the castle towers, softened the sound of marching boots, and turned the royal courtyard into a field of untouched frost each morning. Yet beneath that peaceful blanket, the kingdom had quietly changed forever. New guards entering royal service received an unusual lesson during their first week. Before they were taught sword formations or defensive tactics, they were brought to the scarred stone pillar beside the courtyard gate. The captain would place a hand upon the deep crack left by the assassin's bolt and tell them only one sentence. This mark exists because everyone ignored what one maid refused to ignore. No further explanation was needed. The lesson remained with every soldier who served the Alpha King. One snowy afternoon, Emily carried fresh linens through the western corridor when she noticed a young servant standing motionless outside the council chamber. The boy looked frightened, clutching a stack of official documents against his chest. "Is something wrong?" Emily asked gently. The servant hesitated before answering. I think one of the seals is incorrect." He lowered his voice. "But I'm only an apprentice. I don't want everyone to think I'm imagining things." Emily looked at the wax seal for only a moment before smiling kindly. "Then let's check it together." They carefully compared the document with an earlier royal decree stored in the archive beside the chamber. The apprentice had been right. The seal had been pressed with the wrong signet ring. It was only a clerical mistake made by an exhausted scribe, not another conspiracy, but the discovery prevented an important misunderstanding before it reached the royal council. The young servant looked at Emily with visible relief. "If you hadn't listened." Emily shook her head. "Someone listened to me when no one else would." As she continued down the corridor, the apprentice realized the greatest gift she had given the castle was not simply saving the Alpha King's life. She had given ordinary people the courage to speak when something felt wrong. Later that evening, Logan reviewed reports inside his study while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. Nathan Brooks entered carrying the corrected council documents. "Another mistake caught before it became a problem," he reported. Logan glanced at the seal and smiled faintly. "Emily." Nathan nodded. "Actually, a young servant noticed it first." Logan raised an eyebrow. Nathan continued. "He only reported it because Miss Carter taught him that rank doesn't determine whether an observation matters." Logan closed the report and walked toward the window overlooking the snow-covered courtyard. The castle below appeared calm, but he knew peace did not come from stronger walls alone. It came from a culture where even the quietest voice could prevent disaster. His gaze settled on the courtyard, where Emily crossed the snow carrying another basket of linens, still dressed in the same simple gray uniform she had always worn. She never asked for reward beyond the chance to keep serving honestly. She never sought attention. Yet because of her example, the people around her had begun watching more carefully, speaking more courageously, and respecting one another regardless of title. The assassin's bolt had nearly ended a kingdom in a single heartbeat. Instead, it had awakened one. And long after the conspirators had vanished into history, Blackstone Keep continued to remember its greatest lesson, that the smallest act of courage, offered by the most overlooked person, could protect an entire kingdom when everyone else failed to see the dangers standing right before them. Spring returned to Blackstone Keep almost a year after the morning that had nearly changed the kingdom forever. Snow disappeared from the mountains, the castle gardens bloomed again, and the roads leading to the fortress filled with merchants, travelers, and envoys from neighboring territories. Life looked ordinary once more. Yet beneath that ordinary routine lived a quiet tradition that every visitor eventually noticed. Before each royal procession departed through the eastern gate, no matter how urgent the journey, the Alpha King's carriage remained still for a single extra minute. During that minute, no captain issued commands. No horses moved. No wheels turned. Emily Carter walked once around the carriage in complete silence. She checked every wheel pin, every leather strap, every lantern bracket, every door hinge, every harness buckle, and finally looked directly into the driver's eyes before stepping aside. Only then would Logan enter the carriage. Some foreign nobles privately laughed at the unusual custom during their first visit. They whispered that an Alpha King who commanded thousands of warriors should not delay his travels for the inspection of a maid. Those whispers never lasted long. Benjamin Foster would simply point toward the cracked stone pillar still standing inside the courtyard. No further explanation was necessary. On one bright morning, a young prince visiting from a neighboring territory watched Emily complete her inspection. Curious, he asked Logan, "Your Majesty, surely your captains can perform such duties." Logan smiled faintly without taking his eyes off the carriage. "They can. Then why does she still do it?" Logan answered quietly. "Because my captains inspect the carriage." He paused. "Emily inspects certainty itself." The prince frowned, not fully understanding. Logan continued, "The day people believe something is safe simply because it has always been safe, that is the day danger walks through the front gate unnoticed." The young prince looked toward Emily with new respect. He realized the ritual had never been about a carriage. It was about refusing to let confidence replace attention. As the royal procession departed, several young servants watched from the castle steps. One of them whispered, "Do you think Miss Carter ever imagined all this would happen?" An older housekeeper smiled gently. No. She folded another clean linen towel before continuing her work. That's exactly why it happened. Emily had never chased recognition. She had never tried to impress the Alpha King or earn a place above anyone else. She had simply refused to ignore what she knew was wrong. That choice had quietly changed an entire kingdom. Later that evening, Logan walked alone through the courtyard after the castle had grown quiet. The fading sunlight illuminated the old stone pillar where the assassin's bolt had struck months before. Time had weathered the crack, but never erased it. Logan placed one hand against the rough stone and remembered the moment his hand had rested on the carriage door, only seconds away from death. He remembered a frightened voice breaking every rule inside the royal court. "Please, don't step into that carriage." Had Emily remained silent, history would have remembered that morning very differently. Logan turned toward the castle windows glowing warmly in the evening light. Somewhere inside, Emily was likely preparing the next day's inventory, organizing linens, or helping another young servant learn the work she had quietly mastered years ago. She had returned to an ordinary life, yet nothing about her was ordinary anymore. Blackstone Keep had learned that greatness did not always announce itself with crowns, armies, or titles. Sometimes it wore a plain gray uniform, carried a tray through silent hallways, noticed a missing bracelet, questioned a familiar routine, and possessed the courage to speak when everyone else chose comfort over truth. And so the story of the unnoticed Maid passed from one generation to the next, not as a legend about destiny or miracles, but as a reminder that kingdoms are often saved by the smallest acts of honesty, the sharpest eyes hidden among ordinary people, and one brave voice willing to say, "Don't step forward," before it is too late. Years passed, and children born after the failed assassination grew up believing the morning inspection of the royal carriage had always been part of life inside Blackstone Keep. They had never known a time when the Alpha King's procession departed without first waiting for a quiet maid to complete her careful circle around the carriage. To them, it was simply tradition. Only the oldest servants remembered how that tradition had begun, with one frightened voice, one impossible warning, and a single decision to speak when silence would have been easier. Emily herself never became a noble. She never asked for land, wealth, or authority. The silver wolf clasp remained the only decoration she ever wore, polished each morning with the same care she gave every piece of royal silver. She continued teaching new servants the habits that had once kept her alive. Never assume, she would tell them while checking inventories. Look twice. Listen carefully. Small things matter. Some apprentices expected lessons about cleaning, cooking, or etiquette. Instead, they learned observation. Emily would hand them a tray and quietly ask, "What's different today?" At first, they noticed nothing. Weeks later, they began recognizing tiny details, a crooked portrait, a loose hinge, an unfamiliar messenger, a missing key, an uneven horseshoe, a changed signature. They discovered that protecting a kingdom did not always require a sword. Sometimes it required paying attention. One autumn afternoon, Logan walked through the servants' courtyard without royal escort, something he rarely did. Hidden behind an open doorway, he watched Emily training a group of young maids. She placed 3 identical cups upon a table before asking, which one was moved. Most answered incorrectly. Emily smiled patiently and repeated the exercise. Again and again, she encouraged them to trust careful observation instead of quick assumptions. Logan remained unnoticed as he watched. Nathan Brooks eventually joined him. "She still teaches them the same way," Nathan said quietly. Logan nodded. "Because the lesson never changes." Nathan looked toward the apprentices laughing as they tried again. "Do you think they understand why she's doing this?" Logan answered after a thoughtful silence. "Perhaps not today." His eyes remained on Emily. "But one day, one of them will notice something everyone else overlooks." He paused. "And because of her, they'll speak." That evening, the bells of Blackstone Keep rang as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains. Merchants closed their shops. Soldiers changed shifts along the walls. Servants lit lanterns throughout the castle corridors. Everything appeared peaceful, just as it had on countless evenings before. Yet the peace felt different now because it rested upon thousands of ordinary people who had learned never to ignore the unusual simply because it seemed inconvenient. The greatest change Emily had brought to Blackstone Keep could not be measured in titles or ceremonies. She had transformed the way an entire kingdom thought. She had taught warriors to respect servants, nobles to listen before judging, officers to question certainty, and ordinary people to trust the quiet warning of their own eyes. Long after Emily Carter herself became an old woman, travelers continued hearing the same story whenever they visited Blackstone Keep. They would be shown the cracked stone pillar in the royal courtyard. They would see the Alpha King's carriage waiting for its careful inspection before every journey. And they would hear the words repeated by generation after generation. An Alpha King survived because one maid noticed what everyone else ignored. It was never told as a tale of destiny or magic. It was remembered as something far more powerful. The story of an ordinary woman whose courage proved that the smallest act of honesty, performed at exactly the right moment, could preserve a kingdom, reshape its future, and remind the world that true greatness is often found in the people no one thinks to notice.